A good day to all of you and welcome to Living Multiculturalism with Mayank Bhatt. You are watching TAG TV. The program is brought to you by the Canadian Thinkers Forum. Friends, today we have with us a novelist and an award-winning novelist at that, who has done a tremendous amount of work in exploring the immigrant identity, not just from the perspective of her own cultural background, but understanding the society that Toronto is, that Canada is. Join me in welcoming Farzana Doctor. Welcome, Farzana, to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, let's begin, Farzana, with talking about your latest novel, All Inclusive. I believe it's got a tremendous reception from the mainstream.
Yes,
What
it has.
explains that?
I think, well, I hope it's a good book. Hopefully that's part of the explanation. But also, I think what's been happening is this is my third novel, and it takes a little bit of time to be known as an author in Canada. And I think that my second book maybe offered some leverage so that when this third book came out, more people in the media knew about me, and I got more reviews. And it's been really lovely, like, to have so much coverage across the country with the national media.
Explain the writing process to me. You've done 3 novels. So there has been a gap of about 3 to 4 years in each of those. What is it that firstly attracts you to a subject? How do you write? What What is the process?
So I tend to, because it does take a long time to write a novel, I tend to pick a subject that I'm a bit obsessed about, that's going to hold my attention for a long time. I have a day job. It's mostly part-time. I am a social worker that has a psychotherapy practice, so I'm not a full-time writer. That's also why it takes a few years. So I can tell you how it started with All-Inclusive. I was traveling in Mexico. I was at an all-inclusive resort. I was very awake on that trip. I felt like I was really seeing things through wide eyes. There was a foreign tour representative who, those are the people who meet you at the airport and they try to sell you excursions. And I wondered what it would be like to be her, to work in this place away from home on a 3-year contract. What was life like for her? So for some reason that just crept into my brain and stuck there. And so that was how I created her character. But also, one of the things that I've done with the male characters in all of my books, I think, is I've tried to portray them as the men that I like in my life, the men who I think are the good men, the gentle ones, the ones who will think deeply about things, that won't discriminate, and so on. And of course, they're not perfect, any of these characters. You can't write perfect characters. But I've often tried to imagine those kinds of people, because those are the people who are part of the change we need to have in society, right? So I guess I think a lot about those kinds of men, and then they come out.
The other impressive part about that book was the fact that you were able to portray a milieu which I would imagine you were not culturally born into and were not familiar. So it's an acquired information that you would have.
The Portuguese-Canadian experience?
Yes, yes. And I wanted to briefly describe how you managed to successfully kind of navigate that entire process.
Well, about 12 years ago, I moved to one of the little Portugals in Toronto. And I had the experience that my neighborhood has changed since then, but at the time, I would say, it was 60 to 70% Portuguese Canadian still. And there were a lot of widows who were living on the street. We used to call the street Widow Row, because we would see a lot of these Portuguese widows all dressed in black, which one of the characters is doing in the novel. And, because I grew up in a small white town feeling like the other, I'm very curious about the other people, right? So I wondered what it was like to be those widows, what it was like to be Portuguese Canadian. So I did a lot of observation. But I also did do research. I think if we're going to write about other cultures, we have to do really good research. So I researched a lot, and then I had a few cultural insiders. So Portuguese Canadians who were acquaintances and neighbors, I had them read scenes or sections of the novel. As well, I asked them lots of questions when I thought I was maybe making mistakes, and I had made mistakes and they fixed them. So that's the other piece, I think, when we're writing about people's lives. We have an experience, we have to be very careful and have people on our side helping us.
That brings me to, the question about your own identity. Clearly, while you were raised here all your life, you were still an immigrant.
Yeah.
And if you were to describe yourself and the process of writing, and link it to your experience as an immigrant, how would you narrate that?
Yeah. My family came to Canada when I was 6 months old, and I think that I really soaked up all of the stresses that come with being an immigrant from them. I didn't have to navigate like an adult. I didn't have to find a place to live or figure out the job market or any of that kind of stuff that they did. But I certainly was privy to their experience. I was listening to them talk about some of their struggles as they were going through it. And so that experience has been very important to me. All of my books have had pieces of that experience in it. So I think of myself as, someone who is Indo-Canadian or South Asian Canadian, very Canadian in lots of ways. But, the other thing that happens to people like me and people like you, I think, is that no matter how long we are here, no matter how much we speak with an accent like mine, people tend to ask us, where are you from? So you're never like completely of this country.
Does
right?
That bother you? It never bothers me, for example.
It doesn't, eh?
No.
I think it bothers me because I didn't have the kind of experience that you or my parents' generation had when they were back in India. I think what happens, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think that what happens is when you grow up in your home country, you develop a racial and ethnic identity that ends up being very, very solid. You become very secure in who you are. When you grow up here, as a kid like me, growing up in, which at that time I grew up in Whitby, which was an all-white town. There was one Indian family at the school, and that was us, right? Experiences of bullying, all racism, all that kind of stuff, right? You don't develop a strong and secure ethnic, racial identity, right? You feel like there's something weird about you for a long time until you can, get old enough to counter that stuff, right? I countered that stuff as an adult. But as a child, I had a lot of experiences of trauma around my racial ethnic identity.
I've heard this from several other people who were not necessarily born here but raised here. And I'm not quite sure, how do you actually ever overcome this?
I think it's through talking to other people with the same experience. It's through understanding the socio-political part of the experience as well, understanding and being able to label the experience as racism. Right? When you're a kid, you just know that like the other kids are being mean to you and you think that there's something wrong with you, right? But as you grow older, you're able to say, no, actually the shame of that experience was not mine. The shame of that experience was the racists' shame, and they need to take that back. So that's how you overcome it, I think.
Well, the other question that kind of logically comes from the discussion that we've had so far is would it be correct to identify you as a Muslim?
Yeah, I think of myself as a Muslim.
And what does that imply? What does that mean to you?
I think religion and faith is so personal.
And I ask this purely from your creative aspect.
Yeah.
I don't wish to go into your personal beliefs at
yeah.
all.
So I'll tell you where it all comes from, and maybe that's how it all makes sense. So my family are Dawoodi Boras. My parents originally from Bombay, Mumbai now. They always said Bombay.
Bombay is an emotion, Mumbai is a place.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where they're from, and I have a large extended family. And I like being part of that clan, the Dawoodi Bora clan. They're good people, right? The food is amazing. I have very supportive family members.
Can you make the khichda?
No, I'm not a very good cook. But I like being part of that world. I also grew up in a family that was quite secular. My father, in particular, really is very secular. So I learned about the religion more as I grew older than as a child, although I was always around it, right? Because there are people in my family who are quite orthodox. As I've grown older, and maybe this happens for a lot of people, faith becomes much more important, you know. I've
Why?
always,
Why?
I'm not sure why. I think you become a little less focused on the material world as you get older, perhaps. I've always been a spiritual person, but I have come back to Islam more than some of the other things that I used to follow. So, you know, when I was young, I was very interested in things like paganism and Buddhism. Like I wanted to study everything. I wanted to understand all kinds of religions when I was younger. But I've come back to, I think, something that makes me feel very secure and comfortable because it is where my origins lie.
And that brings me to the question about, does that in any way impinge upon your creative process?
No.
A lot of people I know resent the idea of being identified through the religion, because you know they consider themselves to be writers first, and that identity kind of is the primary identity that they would like to hold.
I think it's hard to separate it out. I think I'm all kinds of things at the same time, right? And I don't think it makes sense to just hold one. So I can be a writer, I can be a Muslim writer, I can be a South Asian Muslim writer, I can be a South Asian Canadian Muslim writer, I can be a South Asian Canadian female Muslim writer, and so on and so on and so on, right? Like, I think all of those things inform my writing practice.
But that would happen, and sorry to belabor this point, but
Go
that would
for it.
happen mostly to people who are not white and not men.
Yes. Yes, there is this thing that happens, of course, and I do resent this, where a straight white dude will write a book and it's just a book. It's just a novel.
And he's just a writer.
He's just a writer. He's not a straight white middle-aged dude writer, right? You know, there's no category at Chapters or Indigo that is, you know, straight white male dude writing. But there probably are categories for women's writing and, you know, Muslim and South Asian or ethnic or whatever, right? And so it does happen quite a lot that we get categorized. And the problem with that, there are positive and negative things to that. The problem with that is that it's very easy for people who don't share those identities to say this is not important writing, right? For the people who do share the identities, it's very easy to find our work, which is terrific, because I want people, I want especially young South Asian women to find my work and read it and maybe connect with it, right?
How difficult is it as a process to then find general acceptance in the mainstream if this sort of identification continues to persist?
Yeah.
Is it a challenge, and how does one overcome this challenge? The question I'm asking this to you because I believe that you've been able to circumvent those challenges and you've been able to establish yourself in the mainstream to a fair degree.
I think it's happened with the third book. I don't think it happened with the first book or the second book. And I think it's because my audience has just grown, and I think as the audience has grown, the audience has diversified, right? And one of the things I think we were talking about earlier was that, so I had a really wonderful publicist who worked with me with this third novel at Dundurn. His name is Jim Hatch. He's no longer there. But he did a fantastic job pitching and pitching and pitching me for all kinds of things, for the media, for reviews, for festivals. And I know that how it works for festivals and reading series and everything is that those people are receiving probably, 100 pitches, 1,000 more than they can accommodate, right? So if they receive a pitch from a really good publicist, and they're pitching a name of an author who they've maybe heard before, because in my case, I had already published 2 novels and I had worked really hard with those 2 novels to self-promote. I think what happens is those people look at the pitch and go, oh, okay, maybe I'll try her out. I'll take a chance with that. So I think it's a lot of factors. I think it's luck, it's good timing, it's privilege of having a publicist and being somebody who is out there now quite a bit. And I think it's hard work.
You've also been featured at the International Festival of Authors, which to most people would be seen as a kind of benchmark. You know, you've arrived.
Yeah, it's very difficult because again, there's very few spots, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of authors.
And
It's like a
so
lottery.
Is it like a lottery, or
I
is
think
it
so.
based on merits?
I think it's both. I think it's merit. I think it's the right time, the right place. I think it's privilege. I think it's all kinds of things. So again, this is very, very small scale, but I curate a very tiny literary series that you're aware called the Brockton Writers Series.
I'm going to talk about that later. But
Okay.
Yes.
So we have 6 events a year. We feature 4 people at each event, 24 people. I probably receive, I don't know, like 2 or 3 pitches a week, right? So that's a lot of pitches. I can't accommodate all of those people. So who do I end up choosing, right? Sometimes it's just my mood that day. Sometimes it's about, oh, we already have 2 women. Okay, so I can put 2 men there. Or I have 2 people of color already. I can have 2 white people. Like it's just, some of it is luck for that day. And some of it is merit, right? Some of it is somebody happened to know me and gave me a call. And I say, okay, which isn't fair.
Which isn't fair at all, I would imagine.
But that's how it happens with the bigger festivals too.
And that wouldn't be fair at all.
It's not fair.
Okay, we hold that thought, I'll come.
When you or your loved one is injured in a car or slip and fall accident, one of the most important decisions you're going to make is the lawyer that you hire. At Alam Law, we take pride in the fact that every person who calls for a free consultation speaks to one of our personal lawyers, not just a legal assistant or agent. Call Alam Law at 416-625-2636 for a free consultation. And remember, you do not pay anything unless I win your case.
Friends, we're talking to Farzana Doctor, an author who's won an international award. We will be talking now about her activism as well as the way in which she is promoting local literature. Farzana, you spoke about the Brockton Writers series that you curate. I've attended that, I've read one of those. I want you to kind of explain to us what attracted you to doing that firstly, how you've been able to turn that into such a big, kind of a calendar, an event on the calendar in Toronto, and where do you plan to take this with you?
It started as a one-time event. I think I had just put out my first novel, and I had recently moved into my neighborhood, and I didn't know a lot of people. I was feeling a bit isolated, both in terms of my neighborhood and as a writer. And I met another writer named Melanie Janice, who owned a cafe in my neighborhood, and I said, hey, why don't we do something? We were walking our dogs at the time when we had this conversation, and she said, okay, let's do an event. So we did an event. It went so-so. It was, not very well attended, but she said, maybe we should do more of this. And so then it became a monthly thing. And then over time, we made it every other month because it was a lot of work. I think how it's become a bigger and better thing is that I've got some really great volunteers on board with me, and the more energy, the more people involved, the better a project gets.
You've also been getting some sort of institutional support now.
Yes, that's huge. We get funding from the Ontario Arts Council so that we're able to pay the writers, which is very important. You want to be able to pay authors for their work. And I think also I'm now 3 books in, so I know authors who have a bit more fame, right? So what I try to do is I try to have a more well-known author with an emerging author and other people in between. And I think because we are people who like celebrity, people will show up when we have Terry Fallis there,
Right.
who's a lovely person and a really great writer. But then what happens when Terry Fallis is there, we can also have, an emerging writer who no one has heard of, and then they get exposure too.
Yes,
So that's
yes.
part of what we try to do.
The other aspect of that series is that you have in the beginning somebody who will actually be giving some sort of a
Yes, a talk.
yes, a talk to educate writers on what avenues there are to publish or to fund. And what is does it serve any purpose, or is this something that you have to fill time with?
Well, what happened was initially, I'm trying to remember how it all happened, but a number of people talk about how writers feel isolated and they sometimes have trouble meeting other authors. And so we initially started with just a writers networking session. So it was a time where, in a very informal way, people could get together, introduce themselves, and chat. And then we thought, well, maybe we need a topic. And so we started having these guest speakers. We've had speakers from the Ontario Arts Council, people who represent agents and publishers, all these kind of how-to topics. And so we do actually find it brings a bigger audience in. We find that people will say, I didn't know how to move from writing fiction to screenplays. I really wanted to learn that. So it seems to be a little bit of skill building, a little bit of networking, and it brings more people in.
Have you ever tried to teach creative writing? Let me finish the question. I haven't. You gave me inputs for my manuscript, which I thought were very, very studied, very, very well informed, and gave me a new direction to, a new perspective to look at what I was doing. And a couple of things that kind of stand out in my memory even now, although the process was far back, at least about 3 or 4 years back, was you told me very clearly that, you're portraying a character of a woman, not as a woman should be or would be portrayed, but from a perspective of a male writer.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of teaching creative writing?
I do a little bit here and there. I now accept manuscripts I offer editorial support. On my website, there's a tab about that if people are interested in that. I teach a few different creative writing workshops, and I really enjoy teaching emerging writers various kinds of things from, self-promotion to really basic things around how do you revise or edit your work. So I do enjoy doing that, and I think how I learned that was from other people who helped me along the way, and then from reading a lot and then editing my own work, you kind of start getting the knack for it. You eventually figure out, this section that I've just written kind of bores me. Why is it boring me? I've got to get in there and figure out how to make it less boring. You just start to figure that out.
Is the process of writing then only mechanical, or is it creative or inspiration?
It's everything. In the beginning, for me, it's more inspiration. It's more listening for those ideas that come from wherever they come from. It's really attaching to a subject. And then later on, it's a bit more mechanical. It's figuring out how do I reduce the repetition in the words and the ideas. How do I move this section here so that it moves more quickly? How do I create a page turner? How do I end a chapter so that someone wants to turn the page?
How important is it for you or for any writer to get feedback while they are in the process of creating a manuscript?
I think it's essential because we get lost in our own work all the time, right? Like, how can we not? It's too subjective. So what I have done is at multiple points of the writing process, I like to do many, many drafts. And when I have a really good first draft, which is really for me, I've gone through it 3 or 4 times, I'll send it off to a few people with a bunch of questions and then incorporate their feedback. And then I'll do another draft and send it out again to a couple more people and ask another set of questions. So I think it's very important to get feedback. I probably sent out the last book to about a dozen people in total.
I think it was at the second book launch when you were asked a question that how many times did you revise the manuscript, and you said you lost count of that.
Yeah.
So how many times should one revise a manuscript?
A lot. Like, you want it to be the best that you can possibly do before you send it out, I think. So for me, what I tend to do is I'll write, and then the next morning when I'm going back to the work, I'll scan that work just to remember what I wrote, because sometimes I forget, but I'll also do a minor edit as I'm going, right? Just to fix it up a little bit. And then I continue on and write a couple more pages, and then I will repeat the process the next day. So there's already an edit happening while I'm doing that first draft. But I think I said I lost count, but it was probably more than a dozen drafts. But you just keep going until you need to stop. Like, you keep going.
When do you stop?
You stop when you can't figure anything out, when your readers tell you it's really good. Yeah. So with the last book, remember I said I almost gave up. I gave it to a writers group I was working with at the time. I gave it to my agent, and they all gave me the thumbs down. So then I went back to it, and I worked and churned it through a couple more times. I gave it out for more feedback, and they were like half that thumbs down. So then I went back and back and back. And it wasn't until the last draft, I gave it to Angie Abdu and my friend Vivek Shreya, and both of them were like, oh, I think it's really close. I would just think about these one or two things. They only had one or two things at that point. And then I knew that I had gotten to where I needed to get, sent it to my agent, who had previously thought that I should just give it up as a project. And she said, brava. And I was like, okay, I think I'm ready. And then, of course, when you're working with, your editor at the publishing house, there's more work to be done. But at that point, I felt like it was 95% done before she saw it, before my editor saw it.
I want to now take the conversation slightly away from writing and the whole process of creative or literature, and to focus on your activist phase. You are part of a group here in Toronto, I believe, kind of creating consciousness about several issues that have to do with religion, society, culture.
It's actually an international WhatsApp group. This is such a modern phenomenon that we are meeting over WhatsApp. Most of the activists are in India, and then there are some in the US, a couple in Canada, some in Australia. And it's a group specifically for Dawoodi Bohra women who, it's a feminist group. I don't know if all the women would identify as feminists, but it's very much a feminist group. And the group came together under the leadership of a couple of women. Masuma Ranalvi was one of the women who was one of the leaders. So there's this very problematic issue in our Dawoodi Bohra community. This is the only community that I know of in India that still practices khatna, which is also called female genital cutting or female genital mutilation. Our community practices type 1 FGM, which involves cutting the skin over the clitoris, or sometimes, if it's not done well, the clitoris itself. It happens to girls when they are 7 years old, and it's done, of course, without their consent, because 7-year-olds can't consent to such nonsense, such violence, such abuse. And it's something that is very secret within the community. No one wants to talk about it. There's so much shame attached to it, and yet it is carried on generation after generation. Usually the men know nothing about it, but the Sayyidna, the high leader, the high religious leader in the community, has said that it is a religious requirement, that it curbs a woman's sexual urges, and so it must be done. So this is an activist group that is countering this. It's trying to educate the community about all of the fiction about this. It doesn't curb someone's sexual urges. What it does is it creates damage to healthy tissues. It creates psychological harm. You know, to create such trauma, unnecessary trauma to girls is really awful. And so there have been a couple of people before Masuma, but Masuma became a citizen journalist, talked about her story, and a number of us got together and created a petition. The petition almost has 30,000 signatures now.
Wow.
And it's going to be, once we have 30,000, they will submit it to the government. And there's a hope that they will get the Indian government to ban this practice, as it's been banned in so many countries across the world. And then what we'll need to be doing, but I think this is the main part, we really need to educate the Bora women about this practice, because it'll still happen in secrecy even though it's illegal. It's illegal to happen here, and yet it happens here. In diaspora communities across the world, people are still doing this practice.
Is this something that is localized only amongst the Dawoodi Bohras, or is it something that is practiced across different ethnic groups?
It happens across the Middle East and in many countries in Africa as well. But in India, what we believe is that it's only done by Bohras. Yeah.
And so what is it that you can achieve sitting in Toronto in Canada?
Well, I'm the Twitter handler for the group. So, you know, what I've been trying to do is, you know, get this petition and the issues out there on Twitter so that more people will become aware of it, so that more Dawoodi Bohra women will join in as activists, because there's a lot of people who quietly are against this practice, but don't know what to do about it, and we can be a voice for that. There are people who are on the fence about it, who haven't given it much thought, think it's kind of not a very good practice, but well, if it's religiously required, then I guess we have to do it. But if we can educate those people who are on the fence, maybe we can stop them from inflicting it upon their daughters, and so on and so on. So I do the work on Twitter for them.
Thank you so much, Farzana, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Friends, we were talking to Farzana Doctor. I hope you enjoyed the show. This is Living Multiculturalism with Mayank Bhatt. The program was brought to you through Canadian Thinkers Forum on TAG TV. Friends, before we end, let me once again make the request that I make always. Send us your suggestions. We would like to know from you who we should be talking to and what about. Keep watching, and thank you.
#1 multicultural channel. This is TAG TV.